I never meant to step inside Caldwell's Antiques that Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after I buried my grandfather. The place had always given me an uneasy feeling, wedged between a defunct bookstore and a Vietnamese restaurant on Merchant Street. The building itself seemed to lean slightly forward, as if perpetually on the verge of toppling into the sidewalk. Dark windows reflected nothing back, even in direct sunlight, creating 2 black voids that watched the street like empty eye sockets. My grandfather had mentioned this shop once, years ago, during one of his increasingly rare lucid moments. He had gripped my hand with surprising strength and told me to never, under any circumstances, enter Caldwell's. When I asked why, his eyes had gone distant and he changed the subject. That was 2 years before the dementia took him completely, before he forgot my name, before he forgot his own. But the rain had started without warning that afternoon, one of those sudden autumn downpours that turns the world into a watercolor painting. My umbrella sat useless in my car 3 blocks away, and my jacket offered about as much protection as tissue paper. I had just come from another fruitless meeting with the estate lawyer, another conversation about my grandfather's debts, another reminder that the photography studio I had been trying to launch would have to wait indefinitely. The antique shop's covered entrance became my reluctant shelter. I stood there watching the rain drum against the pavement, creating rivers in the gutters, my grandfather's warning echoing in my mind. He had been paranoid toward the end, seeing conspiracies everywhere, trusting no one. This was probably just another delusion, another fragment of a mind coming apart. Still, I had avoided this place for 2 years, out of respect for his fear, irrational or not. Then I noticed the door behind me stood slightly ajar, not wide open, just enough to suggest invitation or perhaps carelessness. A small brass bell hung from the frame, motionless despite the gap. Through the opening came a smell I couldn't quite place, something between old leather and dried flowers, with an undertone of copper. And underneath it all, impossibly, the faint scent of my grandfather's tobacco, the specific Turkish blend he had smoked before the nursing home confiscated it. That smell made the decision for me. Grief does strange things to rationality. I pushed the door wider, half expecting to find my grandfather inside, healthy and whole, ready to explain everything. The bell remained silent as I entered. That should have been my first warning. The interior stretched back much farther than the building's exterior suggested possible. Shelves lined every wall, climbing toward a ceiling, lost in shadows, despite it being mid-afternoon outside. The merchandise defied any organizational system I could discern. Porcelain dolls sat next to rusted farm tools. Oil paintings leaned against stacks of leather-bound books. Victorian jewelry boxes shared space with what looked like medieval weaponry. Everything carried a thin layer of dust, undisturbed and uniform, as if it had settled decades ago and nothing had moved since. Everything except a narrow path down the center aisle, where the floorboards showed recent traffic, the dust swept away by passing feet. Someone had been here, and recently. The floorboards creaked under my wet shoes, the sound seeming to travel farther than it should in the cramped space. No other sounds reached my ears. No ticking clocks, no settling wood, no traffic noise from the street I had just left. My photographer's eye catalogued the lighting, all wrong, coming from no visible source, casting shadows that fell at impossible angles. I moved deeper into the shop, following that cleared path, drawn by the lingering scent of my grandfather's tobacco. My fingers traced along a shelf, leaving clean trails in the dust. An ornate mirror caught my reflection, or rather, a strange version of it. In the silvered glass, I looked like my grandfather had in his final days, paler, thinner, with shadows under my eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and inevitable decline. I stepped away from it quickly, my heart hammering. That's when I saw the music box. It sat on a small round table at the end of the cleared path, positioned as if someone had just placed it there specifically for me to find, completely free of dust. The wood was dark, almost black, with intricate carvings covering every surface. But these weren't decorative flourishes. They were scenes, stories carved in miniature. I recognized them immediately because I had photographed something similar just last month while documenting estate sales for extra money. These were the same symbols that had covered my grandfather's workshop walls. The same strange alphabet he had spent his final coherent years studying, claiming it was the language of binding and unbinding, of keeping things in and letting things out. I had assumed it was the dementia, a brilliant mind creating elaborate fantasies as it deteriorated. But here were those same symbols, carved into wood that looked centuries old, in a shop he had warned me never to enter. The designs seemed to shift when I looked at them directly, forming patterns my eyes couldn't quite follow. Silver hinges and a small keyhole decorated the front. No key sat nearby, but I noticed something that made my breath catch. A small engraved plate on the side, partially obscured by shadow. I leaned closer to read it. The inscription was in my grandfather's handwriting. I would have recognized it anywhere. I had boxes of his letters, journals, and research notes sitting in my apartment, waiting to be sorted through. Just 3 words. Don't open again. Again. Not don't open, but don't open again. Meaning he had opened it before. Meaning this specific box had been his, somehow, at some point. Meaning his warning about this shop wasn't dementia-fueled paranoia, but specific, targeted knowledge. I reached for it without fully deciding to, my hand moving with the trained steadiness I had developed as a photographer, fingers positioned to lift without disturbing. The moment my skin touched the wood, a sensation like static electricity ran up my arm. Not painful, but impossible to ignore, carrying with it a flash of something, a memory that wasn't mine. My grandfather, younger than I had ever known him, standing in this exact spot, holding this exact box, his face filled with an expression I had never seen him wear. Hope. Desperate, terrified hope. And behind him, barely visible in the memory's periphery, a woman's shape, indistinct but somehow familiar. The carvings stopped their subtle movement, freezing into a definite pattern. A forest scene with 2 figures, one standing, one lying beneath a tree. The standing figure held something small and dark. A box. A voice behind me spoke, so close I should have felt breath on my neck. The old man hadn't been there a moment ago. I would have bet my life on that. I had been alone in the shop, following a path cleared just for me, finding a box that had belonged to my grandfather. Yet here he stood, less than 3 feet away, as if he had materialized from the shadows themselves. He was ancient in a way that transcended simple old age. His skin had the texture of parchment left too long in the sun, stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent. Wispy white hair clung to his spotted scalp in patches. But his eyes, those were wrong. Too bright, too aware, too knowing for a man who looked like he should be in a nursing home, not running a shop. And they were fixed, not on me, but on the box with an expression of recognition. Those eyes met mine, and in them I saw something that made my stomach drop. He knew my grandfather. Not knew of him, not recognized the name. Knew him personally, intimately, the way you know someone you've dealt with many times over many years. And he had been expecting me. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the sudden ringing in my ears. The static sensation from the box had spread through my entire body now, making my skin prickle and my hair stand on end. But I could read his lips, had learned to from photographing conferences and events. 3 words, repeated. He told you. I tried to pull my hand away from the music box. My fingers wouldn't respond. They remained pressed against the dark wood as if glued there, as if the box itself had decided I belonged to it now and wouldn't let go. The symbols carved into its surface began to glow with a faint green light, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. The old man's mouth kept moving, his expression never changing from that unsettling recognition. The ringing in my ears grew louder, resolving slowly into something that might have been music, a melody both foreign and somehow achingly familiar, like a lullaby I had heard in childhood and forgotten upon waking. My grandmother's lullaby, the one she used to hum when she thought no one was listening, before she disappeared when my father was just a boy. The memory hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather, drunk on cheap whiskey and grief, telling 7-year-old me about my grandmother, how she had simply vanished one autumn day, leaving no note, no trace, no body to bury, how he had searched for 40 years and never found even a hint of what happened to her, how he had only one memento of her, a recording he kept in a music box that he never, ever opened, because the one time he had, something had happened that he refused to explain, even decades later. This box. This was that box. It had to be. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the sensation stopped. My hand came free so suddenly I stumbled backward, catching myself against a shelf. Something fell behind me with a crash that sounded impossibly distant. The old man stood motionless, watching me with those 2 bright eyes, waiting. I found my voice, though it came out rougher than I intended. The words felt thick in my mouth, my tongue clumsy. I wanted to ask about my grandfather, about my grandmother, about what this box really was and what it had done. Instead, what emerged was something else entirely. Words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. I asked about the recording inside, whether it still worked, whether I could hear it. The old man's smile revealed teeth too white and too perfect for someone his age. He said nothing, just gestured at the box with one gnarled hand, an invitation, a challenge, a test. I understood then, with sudden clarity, what my grandfather had been trying to protect me from all these years. Not the shop, not even the old man, but this moment, this choice. He had made it once, decades ago, and it had cost him something. Now the same choice was being offered to me. Walk away, leave the box, go back to my struggling photography business, my mountain of inherited debt, my small apartment filled with an old man's mysteries. Spend the rest of my life wondering what was on that recording, what had happened to my grandmother, why my grandfather had spent 40 years in silent grief. Or open the box, finally get answers, finally understand the fear that had lived behind my grandfather's eyes, even in his clearest moments, the secret that had shaped my entire family's history. The rational thing would be to walk away. Every instinct I possessed screamed that this was wrong, that I should leave immediately, that some mysteries are better left unsolved. But my hands were already reaching for my wallet, already pulling out cash. The old man named a figure, the exact amount I had in my account after paying this month's rent and utilities, down to the dollar. He couldn't have known that. There was no way he could have known that. He knew anyway. The transaction happened in a blur that I would struggle to remember later. Cash changed hands. He didn't take cards, of course he didn't. He wrapped the music box in brown paper with movements that seemed both careful and practiced, his gnarled fingers working with surprising dexterity. But before he closed the wrapping completely, he pressed something into my palm along with the box. Cold metal, old and heavy. A key. His fingers lingered on mine for just a moment, and his two bright eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. His lips moved again, and this time I heard him clearly, his voice like dried leaves scraping across stone. He said my grandmother's name, her full name, the one nobody used anymore, the one I had only seen in my grandfather's old letters. Then he said something else, something in that strange alphabet from the carvings, words that made the air around us feel thick and resistant. The translation came to me unbidden, as if the words carried their own meaning. What was bound can be unbound. What was lost can be found. What was silenced can speak. But every opening demands a closing, and every answer requires a question in return. Then he released my hand, and the moment broke. The package felt heavier than it should when he placed it fully in my hands, as if the box had gained weight during the wrapping process, as if it now contained more than just wood and metal and whatever recording lay inside. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sidewalk steamed in the late afternoon sun that had broken through the clouds. I stood on the street, the wrapped box tucked under my arm, the key burning cold in my pocket, trying to remember exactly how I had ended up purchasing it. But I knew. I had made a choice, the same choice my grandfather had made, and now I would learn what it cost. When I turned back to look at the shop, the old man stood in the window, visible now through the no longer dark glass. He raised one hand, not a wave, but a gesture of acknowledgement, of completion, of something begun that would inevitably reach its end. Then he turned away, disappearing into the shop's shadowed interior. I carried the box home through streets that seemed subtly different from the ones I'd walked 1,000 times before. The shadows fell at wrong angles, pooling in places they shouldn't. The few people I passed seemed to give me more space than usual, their eyes skipping over me and the package I carried as if we weren't quite there, as if we occupied a slightly different version of the world. A dog barked frantically from behind a fence as I walked by, its owner trying unsuccessfully to calm it. I recognized the dog, a usually friendly golden retriever named Sunny that had never so much as growled at anyone. Now it threw itself against the fence, teeth bared, hackles raised, focused entirely on the box under my arm. My apartment building loomed ahead, familiar and solid and real. Or it had been this morning. Now it seemed like a stage set, something that could be packed up and replaced if you knew where to look for the seams. I climbed the 3 flights to my floor, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell, in a rhythm that almost matched the melody I had heard or imagined in the shop. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it that morning. Breakfast dishes still in the sink, laptop open on the coffee table, my failed grant application still on the screen, the stacks of my grandfather's boxes lining one wall, full of his research into symbols and languages that didn't officially exist. The normalcy of it all should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like the last moment before everything changed, the last breath before the plunge, the last second of not knowing. I placed the wrapped box on my kitchen table, in the pool of late afternoon light that came through the west window. The same window my grandmother would have looked through if she had ever visited this apartment, which she hadn't, because she had vanished before I was born, leaving only mysteries and a music box that my grandfather could never bring himself to open again. The brown paper had darkened slightly where my hands had gripped it, showing sweat marks that hadn't been there when I left the shop. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled the key from my pocket. It was old, ornate, made of a metal I couldn't identify. Not brass, not silver, something in between that seemed to shift colors in different light. The rational thing would be to leave it wrapped, maybe even to throw it away unopened. I had acted on grief and curiosity, purchasing something I didn't need from a shop I had been warned against, from a man who knew things he shouldn't. Every instinct I possessed screamed that this was wrong, that I should get rid of it immediately. But my hands were already tearing at the paper, pulling it away in strips that fell to the floor like dead leaves. The music box emerged from its wrapping, unchanged. Dark wood, silver fittings, those impossible carvings that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The symbols my grandfather had spent years studying, now literally in my hands. I set it in the center of my table and circled it slowly, examining it from every angle with a photographer's trained eye, looking for details I had missed in the shop. No maker's mark, no date, no indication of origin beyond my grandfather's engraved warning. The keyhole on the front seemed to go deeper than the box's dimensions allowed. When I peered through it, I saw not the inside of the box, but darkness, absolute and complete, the kind of darkness that exists in deep caves or sealed tombs. The key in my hand grew colder, as if urging me forward. Night had fallen without me noticing, the autumn sun setting early and fast. My apartment lights reflected off the dark windows, turning them into mirrors. In their surface, I could see myself standing over the box, but my reflection seemed to be moving slightly out of sync, reaching for the keyhole a fraction of a second before my actual hand moved, as if it knew what I was going to do before I did. Should have stopped then. Should have wrapped the box back up, returned it to the shop, demanded my money back. Should have honored my grandfather's warning and walked away from mysteries that had already destroyed one generation of my family. But I had spent my entire life in the shadow of my grandmother's disappearance and my grandfather's grief. I had grown up with questions that had no answers, with a family history that had a gaping hole in it, with a grandfather who looked at me sometimes like he was seeing someone else, someone lost. And now, finally, I might understand. The key slid into the lock with a soft click that seemed to echo through my apartment, through the building, through the city itself. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for this exact keyhole, as if every tooth and groove had been designed for this specific moment. I turned it. The mechanism inside engaged with a series of delicate clicks, each one feeling like a small bone breaking. The lock disengaged. The lid loosened under my other hand, ready to be lifted. This was the moment my grandfather had reached 40 years ago. This was where he had made his choice, opened this box and heard whatever was inside. This was where everything had changed for him. I lifted the lid. The music that poured out was my grandmother's lullaby, but not as I had imagined it from my grandfather's humming. This was her actual voice, preserved somehow in the box, singing in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The words spoke of forests and clearings, of bargains made and prices paid, of doors that opened in both directions. Inside the box, mounted on a small rotating platform, stood not the expected mechanical ballerina, but something else. Two figures, impossibly detailed, carved from that same dark wood. One was clearly my grandfather, young and vital. The other was a woman who looked exactly like the old photograph I had seen once. Hidden in my grandfather's desk, my grandmother, beautiful and smiling. The figures stood facing each other, hands almost but not quite touching. As the platform rotated, they moved in a dance, coming together and pulling apart, together and apart, never quite connecting. My grandmother's carved face held an expression of longing. My grandfather's showed desperation. The carved eyes of my grandmother's figure tilted up as it rotated, and impossibly, horrifyingly, they met mine. In that moment of contact, the world lurched sideways. The lullaby swelled to a deafening crescendo, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed, like a door opening in a wall I couldn't see. Images flooded my mind, memories that weren't mine. My grandmother, young and pregnant with my father, walking through a forest I didn't recognize, a clearing, a circle of stones, a bargain offered, safety for her unborn child in exchange for her voice, her songs, her presence in the waking world. She had accepted, thinking it temporary, thinking she could find a way back. My grandfather, years later, finding this box in an antique shop, this shop, Caldwell's shop. The old man, looking exactly the same as he did today, offering him a chance to hear her again, to see her again, to understand what had happened. The price. He could listen once, but if he ever opened it again, the bargain would extend, the cost would double. Someone else would have to choose. He had listened, he had understood, and he had spent the rest of his life making sure no one else in the family ever found the box, ever made the same choice, ever learned what he had learned. But now I had opened it again. The bargain was active once more. Then the lid slammed shut of its own accord, so hard it cracked the table beneath it. The music stopped. The sudden silence rang in my ears like a scream. I stood frozen in my kitchen, hands pressed flat against the damaged table, breathing hard, my mind reeling from what I had seen and felt and understood. My reflection in the window looked back at me, and for just a second, so brief I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, it smiled while my face remained still. And standing behind my reflection, faint but visible, was another figure. A woman with my grandmother's face, her mouth moving, singing words I could no longer hear. The music box sat closed on my table, its carvings now clearly depicting not a forest scene, but something else. A family tree, branches spreading up and out, and at the base, two figures separated by a thin line. On one side, my grandfather. On the other, in the shadows, my grandmother. And at the top, newly carved, so fresh the wood was still light-colored. Me. Outside my window, 3 stories down, I heard footsteps on the sidewalk. Slow, measured, deliberate. They stopped directly below my apartment. In the dark glass, I saw the reflection of someone standing on the street, looking up. The old man from the shop, still wearing that knowing expression, his 2 bright eyes visible even from this distance. He raised one hand, holding something. Another key, larger than the one in my possession. Then he pointed toward the cemetery 3 blocks away, where my grandfather had been buried 3 weeks ago, where my grandmother's name appeared on the other side of his headstone, despite there being no body to bury. The message was clear. I had opened the box. I had heard the truth. Now came the choice. Try to close this door I had opened, or walk through it fully. Find where my grandmother actually was. Learn what my grandfather had been too afraid to pursue. The old man turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the night, leaving me alone with my purchase, with my knowledge, and with the growing certainty that I had begun something that wouldn't end until I saw it through to whatever conclusion waited in the dark. The music box sat waiting on my table. silent now, but I knew, the way you know things in nightmares, the way you know things in truth, that it would play again. And when it did, whatever had begun in Caldwell's antiques that rainy afternoon would continue, following a pattern carved into dark wood by hands unknown, for purposes I was only beginning to understand. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandmother's carved face, her lips moving in that song, her eyes pleading. I heard my grandfather's voice from one of his last lucid days. Some doors should stay closed. Some questions shouldn't be answered. Some prices are too high. But I also remembered his face in those moments when he thought no one was watching, staring at nothing, his expression full of regret and longing. He had chosen not to pursue her, not to pay the price, not to walk through the door. He had chosen safety and ignorance and a lifetime of grief. I wasn't sure I could make the same choice. By morning, I had convinced myself that exhaustion and grief and imagination had combined to create the previous night's experience. The music box was just an antique, a family heirloom that had somehow ended up in a second-hand shop. The old man was simply an eccentric dealer with lucky guesses. My grandmother's voice had been a recording, nothing more. The visions were stress and sleeplessness and the weight of inherited mysteries finally breaking my mind. I almost believed it. Almost. But when I finally worked up the courage to enter the kitchen, as dawnlight crept through my windows, I found three things that shattered that comfortable rationalization. First, the music box stood exactly where I had left it, but the crack in the table beneath it had spread, forming a pattern that looked disturbingly like a path through a forest, leading to a circular clearing. Second, scattered around the box were wood shavings, fresh and fragrant, as if someone had been carving nearby. But the box itself showed no new damage, no signs of being worked. Third, and most impossibly, the box was open. The lid stood raised, revealing the two figures inside. But they had moved. My grandfather's figure now stood alone, his carved hand extended toward empty space. My grandmother's figure was gone, leaving only an impression in the velvet where she had been mounted. And lying in that empty impression, so small I almost missed it, was a photograph that hadn't existed before. It showed my grandmother, but not from 40 years ago. This photo was recent, impossibly recent, taken with modern film stock that I recognized from my own work. She stood in a forest clearing, barely aged, wearing clothes from this decade, holding a sign with today's date written in my grandfather's handwriting. On the back, in that same handwriting, my grandfather had written one final message, dated the day before he died. "I'm sorry, I was too afraid. Don't make my mistake. The path opens at midnight, in the place where names are remembered. Bring the key. Bring the box. Find her. Tell her I never stopped loving her. Tell her I should have come." Something had begun. Something I didn't understand but could no longer deny. My grandfather hadn't been protecting me from a curse or a monster. He had been protecting me from a choice he couldn't bring himself to make, a journey he was too afraid to take, a price he wasn't willing to pay. But he had left me everything I needed to make a different choice. The box, the key, the knowledge, the truth. And somewhere in the city, in a shop wedged between abandoned dreams and foreign cuisine, an old man with two bright eyes was surely smiling, because another member of my family had reached the same crossroads, and this time the path forward wouldn't be refused. The cemetery where my grandfather lay buried was 3 blocks away. Midnight was 14 hours distant. I had until then to decide if I was brave enough or foolish enough to find out what had really happened to my grandmother. what my grandfather had been too afraid to pursue, and what price I would have to pay for answers that had been 40 years in the waiting. The music box sat open on my damaged table, its empty velvet interior waiting to be filled again, its mechanism ready to play another song, its purpose not yet fulfilled. And in my hand, the key grew colder, as if winter itself was calling me forward into a forest I couldn't yet see, toward a clearing where bargains were made and doors swung open, toward a grandmother who had been singing in the dark for 40 years, waiting for someone to finally hear. I woke up on the floor of my kitchen with no memory of how I got there. The music box sat on the table above me, closed now, though I had left it open. My neck ached from the awkward angle against the cabinet, and my right hand was covered in something dark that I initially mistook for blood before realizing it was wood stain. Fresh wood shavings littered the floor around me, and the air smelled of sawdust and that copper undertone I had noticed in Caldwell's shop. My phone said it was 6:47 a.m. I had lost 4 hours. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering. The last thing I remembered was standing over the open music box around 3 a.m., staring at the empty space where my grandmother's figure should have been. Then nothing. A blank space in my memory, as complete as her absence from the world. The wood shavings weren't random debris. They formed a pattern on the floor, symbols I recognized from my grandfather's journals, arranged in a circle around where I had been lying. In the center of the circle, carved directly into my kitchen floor, with what must have been tremendous force, was a single word in that strange alphabet my grandfather had studied. I didn't know the language, had never studied it, but I understood the word anyway. Come. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and took pictures of everything. The circle, the symbols, the carving, the wood stain on my hands. Evidence, proof, documentation that this was real, that I wasn't losing my mind the way my grandfather had seemed to lose his. Then I noticed my camera. It sat on the counter, powered on, the lens cap off. The last photo counter read one of 47. I hadn't taken any photos last night. I was certain of that. I picked up the camera with trembling hands and pulled up the image gallery. The first photo made my blood freeze. It was me, asleep on the kitchen floor, taken from above as if someone had been standing over my unconscious body. The timestamp read 4:23 a.m. I was alone in my apartment. I had to be alone. The second photo showed my right hand holding a carving tool I didn't own, etching symbols into the floor. My eyes were open, but completely white. No iris, no pupil, just blank white orbs. The third photo showed the music box open again, but this time both figures were visible inside. My grandfather and my grandmother, their carved hands finally touching. And standing behind the box, transparent but unmistakable, was the old man from Caldwell's, his two bright eyes staring directly into the camera. I scrolled through all 47 photos with mounting horror. They documented my lost 4 hours in precise detail. Me sleepwalking through my apartment, gathering tools, carving symbols. Me standing at the window, looking out at the cemetery 3 blocks away. Me picking up the music box and whispering to it, my lips forming words I couldn't remember speaking. The final photo was taken at 6:46 a.m., 1 minute before I woke up. It showed my kitchen from floor level, my own perspective, as if the camera had been in my hands. But I was looking at myself, still unconscious on the floor, while simultaneously somehow taking the picture. That was impossible. That was... My apartment door rattled violently. 3 sharp impacts that sounded like someone slamming their fist against the wood. I dropped the camera and spun toward the sound. Silence. Then 3 more impacts. Harder this time. Hard enough that I heard the frame crack slightly. I approached the door slowly, looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. But as I watched, condensation began forming on the inside of the peephole glass, as if something very cold was standing just out of sight, breathing. The condensation formed words. Tonight. I jerked back from the door as 3 final impacts shook it in its frame. Then footsteps retreated down the hallway, heavy and deliberate, even though I could see through the peephole that nothing was there. I couldn't stay here. Whatever had controlled me during those lost 4 hours could do it again. The apartment wasn't safe anymore, if it had ever been. I grabbed my grandfather's journals, my camera, the music box, and the key, shoving everything into my photography bag. The white rose that had appeared yesterday sat in a glass of water on the counter. It should have wilted by now, but it looked fresher than when it had first appeared, the petals more vivid, almost luminescent. I took it too. 15 minutes later, I was in my car, driving with no clear destination, just needing to move, to think, to figure out what was happening to me. The morning traffic was light, the city still waking up. Everything looked normal. People walking dogs, joggers on the sidewalk, coffee shops opening their doors. But I could see the differences now. The shadows that fell at wrong angles. The way people's reflections in store windows didn't quite match their movements. The birds that flew in geometric patterns that shouldn't occur in nature. The world was coming apart at the seams, or I was, or both. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Static filled the line, thick and heavy, punctuated by what might have been breathing or might have been wind through trees. Then a voice emerged from the noise. My grandmother's voice, the same one from the music box, singing that lullaby. But underneath the singing, barely audible, was another sound. Screaming. Someone screaming my name. I dropped the phone and swerved, nearly hitting a parked car. Behind me, horns blared. I pulled over, my whole body shaking, and picked up the phone from the passenger seat floor. The call had disconnected. The call log showed no record of it ever happening. I sat there for 5 minutes, trying to slow my breathing, trying to think rationally. I needed help. I needed someone who understood what was happening, someone who knew about Caldwell's and the boxes and the bargains. There was only one person who might have those answers. I pulled back into traffic and headed for Merchant Street. Caldwell's antiques looked different in daylight. The building didn't lean quite so dramatically. The windows, while still dark, at least reflected the street now instead of showing only void. A closed sign hung in the door, but I could see movement inside, a shadow passing between shelves. I tried the door, locked. I knocked, no response. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. Frustration and fear combined into anger. I pounded on the door with my fist, not caring who heard or what they thought. The shadow inside stopped moving. Slowly, it approached the door, growing larger and more defined. The old man's face appeared in the window, those 2 bright eyes examining me with what looked like satisfaction. He shook his head slowly and pointed at the closed sign. Something inside me snapped. I had lost 4 hours of memory. Something had controlled my body while I slept. My grandmother's voice was calling me from somewhere impossible. And this man, this thing that had been running this shop for over a century, had answers. I pulled out my key ring and raked it hard across the door's window, not caring about the damage, not caring about consequences. The metal screeched against glass. The old man's expression didn't change, He simply watched me with that same satisfied look, like a teacher watching a student finally understand a difficult lesson. Then he reached forward and unlocked the door from inside. It swung open slowly, and that smell rolled out. Leather and dried flowers and copper, stronger now in the daylight, almost nauseating. The old man stood in the doorway, blocking entry, his ancient frame somehow radiating solidity and strength. When he spoke, his voice was exactly as I remembered, dry leaves scraping stone. He told me I was early. That midnight was the appointed time. That coming now, in daylight, in anger, broke the pattern, and patterns mattered very much in this work. I didn't care about patterns. I shoved past him into the shop, my photography bag swinging against my hip, the music box inside it suddenly heavy as lead. The interior looked the same as before, endless shelves, impossible depth, that cleared path down the center. But now I could see other paths too, branching off into the darkness between shelves, leading to sections of the shop that hadn't been visible before. And down those paths, I could see other people, not customers, prisoners, shoppers who had made their purchases and never left, wandering eternally through aisles of might-have-beens and never-weres. The old man closed the door behind me. The lock engaged with a click that sounded final. He told me that by coming here in anger, by breaking the pattern, I had accelerated the timeline. Midnight would not wait. The choice was now, in this moment, in this shop. Choose to pursue the bargain or choose to walk away. But choose now because the door was closing and would not open again. I pulled the music box from my bag and set it on the nearest shelf. My hands were steady now, the anger burned away, leaving only cold determination. I told him I chose to find her. I chose to complete what my grandfather had started. I chose to pay whatever price came due. His smile showed those two white teeth. He told me the price first, before the path. Always the price first. That was the rule, the pattern, the way these things worked. The price was memory. Not my memories of my grandmother. I had none to give. But my memories of my grandfather. Every moment, every conversation, every lesson, every expression of love or frustration or guidance. All of it would be consumed, used as fuel for the door to open, burned away to ash and smoke. I would find my grandmother, but I would forget the grandfather who had raised me, who had loved me, who had tried to protect me from this exact choice. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Trade one for the other. Gain answers, but lose history. Complete the circle, but erase the line that led me here. I thought about my grandfather's face in those final days, lucid moments becoming rare, his memories already slipping away like water through fingers. He had lost everything eventually, his wife, his mind, his life. Now I was being asked to lose him all over again, deliberately, voluntarily. But I also thought about my grandmother, alone in that clearing for 40 years, waiting, hoping, singing songs no one could hear. I thought about the photograph with today's date, proof that she existed somewhere, somehow. I thought about her message. Don't be afraid. I had maybe 10 seconds to decide. 10 seconds to choose between honoring the dead by remembering them or honoring the lost by finding them. The old man waited, patient as stone, as if he had all the time in the world. He probably did. I opened my mouth to answer and heard my grandfather's voice instead, so clear it was as if he stood beside me. Some prices are too high. But I also heard my grandmother's lullaby, that melody that had haunted my family for generations. The price is real, but so is the love that makes it worth paying. I looked at the old man and spoke my choice. He nodded once, unsurprised, and gestured toward one of the dark paths between shelves. A path that hadn't existed a moment before, now clearly visible, lined with lanterns that sparked to life one by one, leading deeper into the shop than any building should contain. At the end of the path, I could see trees, real trees, growing inside the antique shop, their branches heavy with autumn leaves. And beyond the trees, a clearing bathed in moonlight, despite it being 10 a.m. outside. The old man handed me a small bag, heavy with something that clinked like glass. He told me I would need it for the crossing. He told me not to look inside until I reached the clearing. He told me that once I stepped onto that path, there was no returning to this shop, to this moment, to the choice unmade. I took the bag. The music box went back into my photography equipment bag. The key hung cold around my neck. I stepped onto the path between shelves, and the antique shop disappeared behind me as if it had never existed. The lanterns lit my way forward, through aisles that became trees, past shelves that became stones, deeper into a space that existed somewhere between the world I knew and the world where my grandmother waited. Behind me, I heard the old man's voice one final time, calling after me with what might have been warning or might have been blessing. Remember, every door opens both ways. Then the shop was gone entirely, and I was walking through a forest that smelled of autumn and copper, and the faint, distant scent of my grandmother's perfume, toward a clearing where 40 years of waiting was about to end, where a bargain made before my birth would finally reach its conclusion, where I would learn what my grandfather had been too afraid to discover. The path stretched ahead, lit by lanterns that floated without support, leading me forward into the impossible, into the choice made flesh, into whatever waited in that moonlit clearing. I walked faster, then began to run, my photography bag bouncing against my hip, my breath coming in clouds despite the mild temperature, my heart pounding with fear and excitement, and the terrible certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The trees grew thicker, the lanterns burned brighter, and somewhere ahead I heard singing, my grandmother's voice, clear and strong and real, calling me home to a place I had never been, to complete a story that had begun before I was born. The clearing appeared through the trees, exactly as my grandfather had drawn it in his maps, exactly as my grandmother had described in her note. And standing in the center, looking exactly like her photograph, but somehow more real, more present, more alive than any picture could capture, was my grandmother. She smiled when she saw me, and I understood in that moment what the price really meant, what I had truly agreed to pay. But by then, it was too late to turn back. The forest path should have been impossible. I was walking through the interior of an antique shop on Merchant Street, a building I could have circled in 30 seconds, yet the trees surrounding me were real. Ancient oaks with roots that buckled the path, maples dropping leaves that crunched under my feet. The smell of earth and decay and growing things filled my lungs, replacing the leather and copper scent of Caldwell's. The lanterns floated ahead of me, leading deeper into woods that shouldn't exist, their light casting shadows that moved wrong, stretching toward me instead of away, as if the darkness itself was curious about this intruder. I had been walking for what felt like 20 minutes when I realized my phone had no signal. Not unusual in a forest, but I wasn't in a forest. I was in a shop. I was in the city. This was impossible. I pulled out my camera and took a photo of the path ahead. The flash illuminated trees that looked centuries old, the lanterns hanging in space without visible support, and something else, shapes moving between the trunks, keeping pace with me but staying just out of clear view. When I checked the photo on the display, my stomach dropped. The image showed the antique shop's interior, shelves and merchandise clearly visible, but overlaid on it like a double exposure was the forest. Two realities occupying the same space, visible simultaneously through the camera's lens. And in both versions, shop and forest, those shapes were there, watching, waiting. I put the camera away with shaking hands and kept walking. What choice did I have? Behind me, the path had already faded into darkness so complete it seemed solid, like a wall rather than an absence of light. Forward was the only direction that existed anymore. The bag the old man had given me bumped against my leg with each step, heavier than it should be for just 2 small vials. I had promised myself I wouldn't look inside until I reached the clearing, but curiosity and fear were making my fingers itch. Just a quick look, just to confirm what was inside. I stopped walking and opened the bag. The 2 vials were there, exactly as described, swirling with colors that hurt to look at directly. Blues that bled into reds that shouldn't exist. Yellows that seemed to vibrate at frequencies my eyes couldn't quite process. But there was something else. A folded piece of paper I hadn't noticed before. Yellowed with age, covered in handwriting I recognized from the journals. My grandfather's handwriting. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The paper was dated 3 days before he died, during what the nurses had described as his final lucid period. But he had been in a nursing home, heavily medicated, barely able to hold a pen. How had he written this? How had it ended up in a bag given to me by the old man? The note was addressed to me. If you're reading this, you've gone further than I ever did. You're braver than I was, or more foolish. Maybe both. The path you're walking now, I walked it once, 40 years ago. Got as far as the river of names before I turned back. Couldn't pay the price. Couldn't face what waited beyond. There are 3 trials on this path. The old man won't have told you because he never does. He lets you discover them yourself. Lets you fail if you're going to fail. First trial, the river of names. You'll hear voices calling yours. Don't answer. Don't acknowledge them. Once you answer, you give them permission to follow you back. Second trial, the garden of reflections. You'll see yourself making different choices, better choices, easier lives you could have lived. Don't touch any of the flowers. Each one is a path not taken, and touching them traps you in the might have been. Third trial, the echo. This is where I failed. You'll meet someone who knows everything you've lost, everything you've forgotten. They'll offer to give it back. They're lying. What they give back won't be memory. It will be hunger for memory, and it will consume you. If you make it past all 3, you'll reach the clearing. You'll see her, and then you'll understand why I couldn't do it, why the price was too high, why I spent 40 years living with my cowardice. I'm sorry I left you to face this alone. I'm sorry I didn't break the pattern when I had the chance. I'm sorry for a lot of things. But I'm not sorry you're brave enough to try. Don't let fear make your choices. I did, and I regret it every day. One more thing. The trials aren't just tests. They're warnings. Pay attention to what they show you. The pattern wants you to understand what you're really choosing. The note ended there. No signature. Just his handwriting trailing off as if he had been interrupted or had simply run out of strength. I read it 3 times, committing every word to memory, even as I felt those memories of him continuing to fade at the edges. His face in my mind was getting blurrier with each passing minute, the sound of his voice becoming uncertain. The price was still being extracted, payment for standing on this path, for carrying this box, for pursuing what he had abandoned. I folded the note carefully and put it back in the bag with the vials. My photographer's instinct made me pull out the camera again, to document the note, to preserve it. But when I tried to photograph the paper, the camera refused to focus. Every shot came out blurred, the handwriting illegible, as if the note existed in a frequency my camera couldn't capture. Some things couldn't be documented. Some truths had to be carried in memory alone, which was cruelly ironic, given that my memories were actively being erased as payment. A sound reached me through the trees, running water, the river of names. I put the camera away and continued forward. The path curved around a massive oak, and beyond it, I could see the glint of water reflecting lantern light. The air grew colder with each step, my breath starting to fog despite it being autumn, not winter. The river wasn't wide, maybe 20 feet across, but it was dark, the water moving with an oily thickness that suggested it wasn't really water at all. Something thicker, heavier, more alive. A narrow wooden bridge spanned it, old planks that looked ready to collapse under any weight. Several boards were missing entirely, creating gaps that showed the dark liquid flowing below. But it was the sound that stopped me cold. Voices rose from the river, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all calling out names. Some I recognized, my father's name, my grandfather's name, my grandmother's name. Others were unfamiliar, probably ancestors I had never known, family members stretching back through generations. And then I heard my own name, spoken in my father's voice. Every muscle in my body tensed. My father had been dead for 5 years. His voice something I heard now, only in old recordings, an increasingly unreliable memory. But this was perfect. Exactly his tone, his cadence, the slight rasp he'd developed in his final months. He called my name again, and this time I could hear the need in it, the desperation. He was asking for help, pleading with the specific inflection he had used when he was dying, when the pain got too bad and the morphine wasn't enough. Don't answer, my grandfather's note had warned. Don't acknowledge them. But it was my father's voice. The man who had raised me after his own father had taken on that role when dementia made my grandfather unreliable. The man who had supported my dreams of being a photographer even when it made no financial sense. The man whose approval I had sought my entire life and received so rarely that each instance felt like treasure. I stepped onto the bridge, telling myself I was just crossing, just passing through, not answering. The old wood creaked under my weight, and that creaking seemed to excite the voices. They got louder, more insistent. Now I heard my mother, dead since I was 3, calling out with warmth I barely remembered, but desperately wanted to. I heard my college roommate who had died in a car accident our senior year. I heard my first girlfriend, not dead, but lost to time and distance and the casual cruelty of growing apart. All of them calling my name. All of them begging for acknowledgement. My foot touched the middle of the bridge, and the voices changed. They weren't calling anymore. They were screaming. Screaming my name in terror, in pain, in desperate need. My father's voice rose above the rest, shouting that he was drowning, that I had to help him, that I was killing him by staying silent, that what kind of son ignores his father's cries for help? The guilt hit like a physical blow. I had been with him when he died, had held his hand, had told him I loved him. But there had been so many moments before that final one when I hadn't been there, when I had been too busy with my struggling photography business, when I had let calls go to voicemail because I couldn't handle hearing how much worse he was getting. The screaming grew louder. Now it wasn't just my father. It was everyone I had ever failed, ever disappointed, ever let down. friends I had drifted away from, lovers I had hurt through neglect or cowardice. My grandfather screaming that I had abandoned him in that nursing home, that I had stopped visiting when his dementia got bad because it was too painful to see him like that. That last one cut deepest because it was true. I had stopped visiting as frequently in his final months. The man who raised me had become a stranger who sometimes didn't recognize me, and I had used my failing business as an excuse to stay away. My mouth opened. I was going to answer. I couldn't help it. The guilt was too heavy, the screaming too perfectly calibrated to exploit every wound I carried. Then I felt something cold against my chest, the key hanging around my neck. It had been room temperature before, but now it was freezing, cold enough to hurt, cold enough to shock me back to awareness. I clamped my mouth shut and tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I looked down and saw why. The bridge itself had changed. The wooden planks were now covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all showing moments from my life. Me as a child with my father. Me in high school with my grandfather. Me at my mother's grave on the anniversary of her death. And in each photograph, I was looking away, distracted, elsewhere. Even in moments that should have mattered, I was only half present. The voices screamed louder, and now they were chanting words instead of just my name. You were never really there. You were never really there. You were never really there. Hands reached up from the dark water, pale, dripping hands grasping for my ankles. The fingers were too long, the nails too sharp, but they wore rings I recognized. My father's wedding band, my grandfather's signet ring, my mother's engagement ring that my father had kept all these years. They grabbed my legs and pulled. I fell hard onto the bridge, my palms slapping down on those photographs of my failures. The wood cracked under the impact, splinters driving deep into my hands, and I felt the bridge starting to collapse. The hands pulled harder, dragging me toward the edge, toward the dark water. I could see faces forming in the liquid now. My father, my mother, my grandfather, all the people I had failed, all reaching up to pull me down into the river of guilt and regret. I scrambled for purchase, my bleeding hands leaving smears of red across the photographs. One of the gaps in the bridge was right in front of me, wide enough to fall through, and I was sliding toward it. Then I noticed something about the photographs under my hands. They were changing. The images of me looking away, being distracted, were shifting to show what I had been looking at instead. My camera. Always my camera. Even in moments with loved ones, I had been mentally composing shots, calculating light, framing the world through a lens. I had been so obsessed with capturing moments that I had failed to live in them. The realization should have crushed me, should have made me give up and let the hands pull me under. Instead, it made me angry. At myself, yes, but also at this trial, at this river, at the pattern that thought it could judge me. I had made mistakes. I had been absent when I should have been present. I had prioritized my art over my relationships. All of that was true. But I was here now, wasn't I? I had walked this path, faced this trial, bled for this journey. I was trying to complete what my grandfather had been too afraid to finish. That had to count for something. I yanked my legs free from those grasping hands, tearing my pants, feeling nails rake across my skin, hard enough to draw blood. I lunged forward, away from the gap, my torn palms screaming in protest as I grabbed the bridge's railing. The wood was rotting, ready to crumble, but I used it to pull myself up. The bridge shook violently, more planks falling away into the dark water below. The screaming voices reached a crescendo that felt like it would rupture my eardrums. And then I made my mistake. Not intentionally, not consciously. But as I pulled myself to my feet, as blood dripped from my hands onto the photographs, I whispered a single word: sorry. The moment the word left my lips, I knew I had failed. I had answered. I had acknowledged them. The screaming stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my skull. The hands released their grip. The bridge stopped shaking. And then something rose from the river. Not my father, not my mother, not any person I recognized. Instead, it was a shape made of all of them combined, a twisted amalgamation of everyone I had ever hurt, ever failed, ever disappointed. It stood on the water's surface as if the dark liquid was solid ground, its body constantly shifting, faces emerging and disappearing in its form. It stepped onto the bridge behind me, and I heard the wood groan under its weight. I ran. The far side of the bridge was only 10 feet away, but those 10 feet felt infinite. Behind me, I could hear the thing following, could hear the wet slap of its footsteps, could smell the river stench it carried. My torn hands grabbed the railing on the far side, and I threw myself forward, landing hard on solid ground just as the thing reached for me. Its fingers, dozens of them, all from different people, brushed the back of my jacket but didn't catch. I rolled away and scrambled to my feet, expecting it to follow me onto the shore. But it couldn't. It stood at the edge of the bridge, unable to cross onto the far bank, bound by rules I didn't understand. The amalgamation of my failures stood there, watching me with too many eyes. Its mouths, forming words I couldn't quite hear. Then it turned and walked back into the river, sinking below the surface, and the bridge collapsed entirely, planks falling into the dark water and dissolving like sugar. I collapsed onto the path, gasping, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack a rib. My hands were torn up badly, blood dripping from deep splinters embedded in my palms. My legs were scratched and bleeding through my ripped pants. My jacket was shredded, but I was across. I had made it. I had answered. I had failed that part of the trial, but I had survived anyway. When I looked back, there was no river, no bridge, no trace that they had ever existed. Just path behind me and path ahead, as if the trial had never happened. But my torn clothes and bleeding hands said otherwise. The trials weren't just mental or spiritual. They left physical marks, extracted physical prices. I pulled off my jacket and tore strips from the lining to wrap my hands. The fabric quickly soaked through with blood, but it would have to do. I checked the bag with the vials, miraculously undamaged, and confirmed the music box in my larger bag was intact. Then I noticed something new in the bag with the vials. Another note, this one in handwriting I didn't recognize. Spidery, ancient, probably the old man's writing. You answered, you failed, but you survived. Interesting. Most who fail the first trial don't make it to the second. The river usually keeps them, but you fought through anyway. Stubbornness or stupidity? We'll see. The next trial won't be so forgiving of failure. Choose more, carefully. I crumpled the note and threw it into the woods. My hands screamed in protest at the motion, but I didn't care. I was tired of being tested, tired of being judged, tired of paying prices for choices I had barely made. But I kept walking. What else could I do? The forest around me was changing, the trees becoming more orderly, almost deliberately placed. Their branches formed archways over the path, creating a tunnel effect that felt both beautiful and threatening. And flowers I didn't recognize bloomed everywhere, impossible colors that hurt to look at directly, blues too bright, reds that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, yellows that left after images when I looked away. The Garden of Reflections. The flowers weren't just growing wild, they were arranged in precise patterns, geometric designs that my photographer's eye recognized as intentional composition. Someone or something had planted this garden with specific purpose. As I walked past the first cluster of flowers, I started to see images in their petals, not reflections exactly, but scenes, moments, lives that could have been. A brilliant crimson bloom showed me at 22, accepting a job offer at a prestigious photography studio instead of trying to launch my own business. In that vision, I was successful, financially stable, married to someone beautiful whose face shifted between several people I had dated. No debt, no struggle, no fear. I had a nice apartment in a good neighborhood. My work hung in galleries. Critics knew my name. The flower's perfume reached me even from several feet away, intoxicating, promising, seductive. It smelled like success and stability and all the things I had failed to achieve in my real life. Don't touch any of the flowers, the note had warned. But God, I wanted to. I wanted to reach out and grab that crimson bloom, to step into that easier life, that successful version of myself who had made smarter choices. I forced myself to look away and keep walking, but it got harder with each step. More flowers lined the path, each showing different choices, different paths. A deep purple flower showed me staying in my hometown instead of moving to the city. In that life, I ran a small photography studio, doing weddings and senior portraits. Nothing glamorous, but stable, safe. I had friends I had known since childhood. I went to the same bar every Friday. I dated a girl from high school who had never left town either. A golden flower showed me pursuing music instead of photography. I was in a band, playing small venues, barely making money, but loving every second. The passion in that version of myself was almost painful to see. When was the last time I had felt that way about my photography? A silver flower showed me in a dozen different relationships with a dozen different people, each one looking happier than any relationship I had actually had, each one showing me being present, being attentive, being the partner I had never quite managed to be in reality. I walked faster, trying not to look, but the flowers seemed to multiply. Hundreds of them now, thousands, each showing a different path, a different choice, a different version of myself who had done better, been better, lived better. And then I saw the pale blue flower. It was larger than the others, positioned directly in the center of the path, so I couldn't avoid passing close to it. In its petals, I saw myself at my grandfather's bedside during his final days. But in this version, he was lucid, aware, able to speak. We were having a real conversation, crying together, laughing together, saying all the things that had gone unsaid in reality. He was telling me he was proud of me, that I had become everything he had hoped I would be, that my photography mattered, that my art was important, that he loved me. All the things I had needed to hear and never got, because dementia had stolen his mind before we could have that conversation. My hand reached out before I consciously decided to move it. My fingers trembled inches from the petals, so close I could feel warmth radiating from the flower. Just one touch, just to hear those words, just to have that moment I had been denied. My fingertips brushed the petals, the world inverted. Suddenly, I wasn't on the path anymore. I was in the vision, sitting beside my grandfather's bed, holding his hand. He was smiling at me, clear-eyed and present, and he was speaking, telling me all those things I desperately wanted to hear. It felt so real. His hand was warm. His voice was exactly right. The hospital room was perfectly detailed, down to the specific beat pattern of his heart monitor. But something was wrong. His words were right, his tone was right, but the content was empty. He was saying he was proud, but he couldn't say specifically what he was proud of. He said my photography mattered, but he couldn't name a single photo I had taken. He said he loved me, but the reasons he gave were generic, applicable to anyone. This wasn't a memory. It wasn't even a might have been. It was a fantasy, a shallow construction of what I wanted to hear without any of the depth that made real moments meaningful. And I was trapped in it. I tried to pull my hand away from his, to stand up, to leave the hospital room. But I couldn't move. The vision held me locked in place, and I understood what the warning had meant. Touching the flower trapped you in the might have been, forced you to live in a shallow fantasy forever. My grandfather kept talking, saying nothing, his words becoming repetitive. The loop was short, maybe 30 seconds, and it was already starting to repeat. Soon, I would notice the repetition. Soon, the illusion would crack. And then I would be conscious and aware, but still trapped, living the same meaningless 30 seconds over and over for eternity. Panic hit hard. I fought against the vision, trying to force myself back to reality, but it was like fighting quicksand. Every struggle just pulled me deeper. Then I remembered my camera. I always had my camera. Even in this vision, even in this fantasy version of a moment I wished had happened, my photographer's instinct had put the camera in my bag beside the bed. I couldn't move my body, but I could move my awareness. I focused on the camera, on its weight and shape, and the specific feel of its controls under my fingers. Real details, not fantasy constructions. Things I knew with absolute certainty. The vision flickered. My grandfather's face glitched for a moment, becoming generic, a placeholder. I focused harder on the camera, remembering specific photographs I had taken. The light on my father's face during his last birthday. The way frost had formed on my apartment window during an unusual cold snap. The exact grain structure of a black and white print I had made in college. Real memories, real moments, real details that this fantasy couldn't replicate because it only knew what I wanted, not what I had actually experienced. The vision cracked like glass, and I felt myself falling through it, tumbling back toward reality. I hit the ground hard, my already injured hands sending spikes of pain up my arms as they broke my fall. I was back on the path, sprawled in the dirt, the pale blue flower swaying gently above me. But I wasn't alone. A figure stood on the path ahead, a woman made entirely of flowers, her body constantly blooming and wilting, petals falling and being replaced in an endless cycle. Where the petals fell, new flowers sprouted, each one showing a different might have been, different versions of different people making different choices. The flower woman didn't speak, but I understood her message anyway. The garden wasn't just showing me easier lives, it was showing me the truth about choice. Every decision made was infinite decisions unmade. Every path taken was countless paths abandoned. And all those abandoned possibilities didn't just disappear. They existed somewhere, in some form, eternally showing what might have been. I had touched a flower. I had failed this trial too. But like with the river, I had fought my way through anyway, had refused to accept the trap. The flower woman gestured to the path beyond her, and I saw that the garden was ending. The flowers were becoming sparser, the trees returning to wild forest. The second trial was complete. But as I stood and walked past the flower woman, she reached out and touched my forehead. The touch was gentle, but left a mark I could feel, a burning sensation right between my eyes. When I looked back, she was gone, dissolved into falling petals that disappeared before hitting the ground. But the burning remained, and I understood what she had given me. Every person I would see from now on would appear overlaid with flowers, showing me their might-have-beens, their abandoned possibilities. I would see not just who they were, but who they could have been, should have been, might have been. Every conversation would be haunted by the ghost of better conversations. Every moment would be shadowed by better moments that never happened. Another price paid. Another consequence of failure. I wrapped my torn hands tighter and kept walking. My clothes were shredded. My hands were bleeding. My forehead burned. And I had only completed 2 of 3 trials. Failed both of them and survived through stubbornness rather than success. The 3rd trial wouldn't be so forgiving, the old man's note had said. The forest grew darker ahead. The lanterns that had been guiding me began to flicker and dim. I had to slow down, picking my way carefully over roots and rocks, leaving traces of blood on branches I used for balance. I had been walking for what felt like hours when I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees, not even the sound of my own footsteps anymore. The path beneath me had become soft, almost spongy, absorbing sound. Then I heard breathing behind me. Not footsteps, just breathing. Slow, measured, deliberate. I turned around but saw nothing in the darkness. The lanterns had dimmed to almost nothing, barely providing enough light to see my own hands. The breathing came again, closer this time. Definitely human, definitely real. Then a voice emerged from the darkness. My grandfather's voice, exactly as I was forgetting it, filling in the gaps in my failing memory with perfect clarity. The echo. A figure emerged from the shadows between trees, stepping into the weak lantern light. My grandfather, not as I had last seen him, frail and fading in a nursing home bed, but as he must have been in his prime, 50, maybe 55, strong and vital and whole. Every detail was perfect because it was being pulled directly from my fading memories, using the last scraps of recollection to construct this form. He smiled, and it was so achingly familiar that I felt tears spring to my eyes. The smile I was forgetting, now preserved perfectly in this thing that wore his shape. The echo spoke in my grandfather's voice, telling me everything I needed to hear. He was proud. He was sorry for being afraid. He loved me. He understood why I had come. He forgave me for the times I hadn't visited, for the distance I had kept when his mind started to go. And then he held out his hand, and in his palm was a small glass vial, different from the 2 in my bag. This one glowed with warm golden light. He explained what it was, a reversal of the price. 1 drop of the liquid inside would stop the forgetting, would restore every memory of him that I was losing. I could have it all back. Every moment we shared, every lesson he taught, every expression of love or frustration or guidance, sharp and clear and permanent. All I had to do was take the vial and drink it. I stared at the offered vial, wanting it more than I had wanted anything in my life. My memories of him were almost gone now, just fragments and impressions, the specific moments erased. This vial promised to restore all of it, but I looked at his eyes, and something was wrong. They were too bright, the same too bright quality as the old man's eyes, as the eyes of the thing that had risen from the river of names. This wasn't my grandfather. This was something else, something that knew exactly what I was losing and exactly how to exploit that loss. I took a step back. The echo's smile didn't falter. It spoke again, and now there were harmonics in the voice, multiple tones overlapping. It told me most people grabbed for the vial immediately, desperate to reclaim what they were losing. And the vial worked. It did restore the memories. But what it restored wasn't real. They were false memories, perfect and detailed and completely hollow. And once someone drank it, they became trapped in those false memories, unable to distinguish them from reality, lost in a maze of their own constructed past. They stood frozen on the path forever, living and reliving moments that had never happened, growing more disconnected from reality with each iteration until nothing real remained. The forest was full of them, people who had accepted the echo's gift and been consumed by it. I asked why it was telling me this, why it would warn me about its own trap. The echo shifted, its form becoming less solid, more transparent. Multiple voices spoke through it now, creating harmonics that made my bones ache. It explained that it wasn't malevolent, it was a filter, a test, a guardian. My grandmother was real, was waiting, was reachable, but only by people willing to pay the actual price, not by people trying to cheat the bargain by reclaiming what they had already traded. Those who accepted the false memories weren't worthy of reaching the clearing. They were too afraid of loss to accept sacrifice. They wanted answers without consequences, reunion without cost. Then the echo did something I didn't expect. It shifted forms, and suddenly I was looking at my grandmother, not as she would be now, but as she had been 40 years ago, young and beautiful and terrified, standing in a different clearing, facing a different echo, being offered a different vial. The echo showed me her trial. She had been offered the same choice: take the vial and reclaim her memories of the life she was leaving behind, or refuse and let them fade. She had refused, had accepted the forgetting, had stepped into the twilight with nothing but her determination and her love for the child she was protecting. That's why she had survived. That's why she had made it through. Not because she was strong enough to hold on to everything, but because she was brave enough to let go. The echo shifted back to my grandfather's form and held out the vial again. Final offer. Last chance. Take it and be consumed by perfect false memories, or refuse and complete the journey with nothing but fragments and loss. I looked at the vial, genuinely considering it. The price I was paying, forgetting the man who raised me, was so high. Too high, maybe. Would arriving at the clearing with no memory of why I had come even mean anything? But I thought about my grandmother, standing in that twilight for 40 years, holding on to nothing but hope and determination. I thought about the trials I had already faced, the prices I had already paid. I thought about the note my grandfather had left, telling me not to let fear make my choices. And I thought about the photographs I had taken throughout my life, moments captured, preserved, but never truly lived in. I had spent so long trying to hold on to things through images that I had forgotten how to experience them directly. Maybe that was the lesson. Maybe the point wasn't to preserve everything perfectly, but to live through things fully and let them go when their time passed. I spoke for the first time since entering the forest, my voice rough from disuse. I refused the vial. I would finish this journey carrying only fragments, only loss, only the hollow space where memory should be. The echo stood motionless for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The vial in its hand dissolved into golden mist that faded into the darkness. It spoke one final time, its voice layering my grandfather's tone with something ancient and sad. It told me I was the first person in 70 years to refuse the echo's gift. Most people grabbed desperately for what they were losing, unable to accept that some things couldn't be held onto, some losses couldn't be prevented. Then it said something that made my blood freeze. The hardest part wasn't refusing the vial. The hardest part would come after, in the clearing, when I would have to make choices without remembering why those choices mattered. Sacrifice was easy when you could remember what you were sacrificing for. But sacrifice without memory, that was where most people broke. The echo stepped aside, gesturing to the path beyond. The final stretch, the last bit of forest before the clearing where my grandmother waited. But before I could move, it did something unexpected. It reached out and touched my chest, right over my heart, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. It wasn't giving me back my memories. It was marking me. Every person I encountered from now on would be able to sense what I had lost, what I had sacrificed, what I had paid. They would see the hollow space where my grandfather's memory should be, and they would judge me for it. Some would respect the sacrifice. Others would see only the loss. Another price, another consequence. The echo faded back into the darkness between trees, and I was alone again. 3 trials complete. 3 failures survived through stubbornness and pain, rather than success and wisdom. My hands were torn and bleeding. My forehead burned from the flower woman's mark. My chest ached from the echo's touch, and my memories of the man who raised me were almost completely gone. Just the faintest impressions remaining, like photographs left too long in sunlight. But I was still walking, still moving forward, still refusing to let the trials break me. The lanterns brightened suddenly, blazing with renewed intensity, lighting the path ahead so clearly I could see the clearing in the distance. Moonlight, impossible moonlight, given that it was mid-morning in the real world, spilled through the trees, turning everything silver and strange. I could see her now, my grandmother, standing in the center of the clearing, exactly as she had appeared in the photograph, waiting. I had survived all 3 trials by failing them and continuing anyway, by paying prices I hadn't fully understood, by accepting consequences I hadn't anticipated. The journey had marked me, changed me, taken things from me that could never be restored, and I still didn't know if it was worth it. But I had chosen. I had walked the path, and now I would see it through to whatever end waited in that moonlit clearing. I took a breath, adjusted the bag with the vials, felt the key cold against my chest, felt the burning mark on my forehead, felt the hollow ache in my chest where the echo had touched me. Every step had cost something. Every trial had taken its pound of flesh. I stepped out of the forest into the clearing where my grandmother stood, where 40 years of waiting was about to end, where the final choice still waited to be made. She turned toward me as I emerged from the trees, and her expression shifted from relief to horror as she saw the state I was in. Torn clothes, bleeding hands, marked and changed by the trials. She rushed toward me, and I saw flowers blooming in her wake, showing all her might-have-beens, all the lives she could have lived if she hadn't made her bargain. The flower woman's mark let me see them clearly. Versions of her growing old with my grandfather, raising my father, meeting me as a grandmother should. All the possibilities she had traded away, now visible, now haunting. I walked toward her across grass too perfect to be real, and I understood finally what my grandfather had been too afraid to face. It wasn't just seeing her again that had broken him. It was seeing all the might-have-beens, all the lost possibilities, all the different ways their lives could have unfolded. It was seeing the true cost of the bargain, measured not just in what was lost, but in what was prevented from ever happening. We met in the center of the clearing, two people marked by sacrifice and loss, surrounded by the ghosts of better choices, carrying the weight of trials survived and prices paid. And the real story was about to begin. The bag with the vials felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Somewhere in the darkness, at the forest's edge, I felt the echo watching, waiting to see if I had truly been worthy of reaching this point. The trials were over, but the test had just begun. My grandmother reached me before I could collapse. Her hands caught my arms, and the shock of her touch, warm, solid, real, nearly broke me. For 40 years she had been an absence, a ghost in family stories, a voice in a music box. Now she was flesh and blood, steadying me as my legs gave out. Up close, I could see how time had stopped for her. No grey in her hair, no deep lines around her eyes. But those eyes themselves carried weight that transcended age. 4 decades of watching the world through a veil she couldn't cross, seeing her son grow up and die without her, seeing a grandson she would never meet become a man. The flower woman's mark on my forehead pulsed, and suddenly I could see them, all the might-have-beens blooming around her like an aura, her growing old with my grandfather, holding my infant father, attending my parents' wedding, meeting me as a child, teaching me to bake cookies, to garden, to laugh. 40 years of moments that should have happened, now visible as ghostly flowers that bloomed and wilted in endless cycles. She saw me staring and understood. Her expression crumbled. She guided me to sit on the too perfect grass, and I let her. Blood was still seeping through the torn fabric I'd wrapped around my palms. My pants were shredded at the knees, showing scratches that had crusted over. The burn mark on my forehead throbbed with each heartbeat. We sat in silence for a long moment. The clearing existed in permanent twilight. The moon hung full overhead. Despite it being morning, in the real world, stars visible against a sky caught between day and night. At the clearing's edge, the forest I'd walked through looked different from this side. The trees were translucent, half real, and through them I could glimpse other clearings, other figures trapped in their own twilight prisons. My grandmother pulled a small cloth from her pocket, purple, the same color as the jumper on the carved doll my grandfather had made. She began cleaning my torn hands with movements that were gentle but unpracticed, as if she was remembering how to care for someone after 40 years of solitude. She was crying silently as she worked, tears dripping onto my palms and mixing with the blood. I tried to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions burning through me, but my throat was raw. The trials had taken more than just blood and skin. They'd taken my voice, at least temporarily. She shook her head, understanding without words. We had time, she said. The clearing existed outside normal time. Minutes here could be hours in the real world, or seconds. The twilight made its own rules. As she picked splinters from my palms with careful precision, I studied her face, looking for my father in her features, for myself, for the connections that should bind us. They were there, in the shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw, the unconscious grace of her movements. My father had inherited her hands. I had inherited them from him. 3 generations connected by the same long fingers, the same broad palms. She finished bandaging my hands with strips torn from her own clothing and sat back. Her hands were stained with my blood now, and the sight seemed to devastate her. She stared at her palms like they were evidence of crimes she'd committed. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked on the first word. She told me she was sorry, that she had prayed no one would ever come. that my grandfather would destroy the music box, that her sacrifice would be the end of it. She had thought by accepting the bargain, by stepping into twilight, she would break the cycle. But patterns didn't work that way. She had spent 40 years in this clearing, watching the world change through the veil, unable to touch it, unable to leave. She had seen my father's entire life in glimpses, birthdays she couldn't attend, his wedding, his grief when my mother died, his slow decline. She had seen me grow from infant to man, a grandson she could never hold. And she had seen my grandfather, watched him age and hollow out with guilt and grief, watched dementia steal what was left of him, watched him spend 40 years searching for answers, for solutions, for ways to bring her back or break the pattern. The worst part, she said, was the night he found the music box in Caldwell's Antiques. She had felt it the moment he touched it, a sudden connection across the veil, the first time in decades she could sense him clearly. For one impossible moment, she thought he was coming, thought he would walk the path, pay the price, bring her home. Instead, he opened the box, heard her voice, and closed it again, walked away, chose safety over reunion, fear over love. She understood why. The price was terrible, the risks were real, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. She had spent the next 40 years knowing he had found her and chosen not to come, until the music box found me. She asked how he died. I tried to answer, but the memories were almost gone, erased as payment for walking this path. I could remember facts, nursing home, dementia, a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, but not his face in those final moments, not his last words, not whether I'd told him I loved him, not the weight of his hand in mine or the sound of the heart monitor going flat. The information was there, but the emotional truth of it had been taken. When she realized what I had paid, what I had lost to reach her, her face went through a transformation I would see in my nightmares for years after. Horror, guilt, grief, and something else. Rage, maybe. At the pattern, at the old man, at herself for making the bargain that started all this. She reached out and touched my forehead, right over the burning mark the flower woman had left. She gasped and jerked her hand back. She could see it all, the river's mark that gave voices permission to follow me. The garden's curse of seeing might-have-beens in everyone I met. The echo's brand broadcasting my sacrifice to anyone with the sight to perceive it. And underneath it all, the hollow space where my grandfather's memory should be. A void shaped like the man who raised me. She stood abruptly and walked to the center of the clearing, her back to me. When she spoke again, her voice was harder, more controlled, pushed past grief into something colder. She told me about the vials. I already knew the basic choice, one to open the door for her return, one to seal it forever and break the pattern. But she told me the rest, the parts the old man had left out. The opening vial required a trade, someone to stand in this clearing for the time she was gone. Not forever. The bargain had evolved, become more sophisticated over centuries. 1 year. 1 year of my life in this frozen twilight, alone with my thoughts and the weight of what I'd done. But time moved differently here. A year in this clearing might be 10 years in reality, might be 50. I could return to find everyone I knew dead, the world unrecognizable, my entire life dissolved in my absence. And there was no guarantee the clearing would release me after that year. The pattern was clever. It found loopholes, created complications. I might step in for 1 year and become trapped for 40, just as she had been. The closing vial would seal the door forever, trap her here until she faded. but it would break the pattern for our bloodline. My children, if I had them, would never be visited by the old man. Their children would be free. The curse would end. She would have perhaps 10 more years before the twilight dissolved her completely, turned her into just another shadow in the forest. She told me all this while staring at the too bright moon, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. She told me she wouldn't blame me for either choice, wouldn't judge, wouldn't hold it against me. The decision was mine. I pulled the vials from the bag, feeling their weight increase as I held them, as if the clearing's reality made them more substantial. The liquid inside swirled with impossible colors, geometries that shouldn't exist folding in on themselves. My hands were shaking despite the bandages. One vial labeled with a symbol meaning passage, one labeled with a symbol meaning ending. I looked at them both, then at my grandmother's back, then at the forest of half-real trees surrounding us. I thought about my grandfather spending 40 years in cowardice and regret. I thought about my grandmother spending 40 years in solitude and hope. I thought about the trials I'd survived, the prices I'd paid, the marks I carried. And I thought about the note my grandfather had left me. Don't let fear make your choices. I stood, my legs steadier now, and walked to where my grandmother stood. She turned to face me, and I saw acceptance in her expression. She had already made peace with whatever I decided. I asked her a question. Did she know exactly how the vials worked? The mechanism, the magic, the specific way they functioned. She blinked, surprised by the question. She knew what they did, she said, but not how. The pattern didn't explain its tools. It just offered choices and demanded decisions. I looked down at the vials again, really looked at them. The labels were in that strange alphabet my grandfather had spent years studying, the language of binding and unbinding. I had seen these symbols before, in his journals, carved into the music box, etched into the clearing's trees. And I had seen something else, something he had written in one of his final journal entries during his last lucid period. A theory he'd developed but never tested about the nature of the pattern's tools. The vials didn't create effects. They revealed existing possibilities. They didn't make doors or endings. They simply showed what was already there, hidden, waiting to be acknowledged. If that was true, then the labels weren't instructions. They were descriptions. One vial showed passage, one showed ending. But passage and ending existed already, independent of the vials. The liquid just made them visible, made them accessible. Which meant there might be other possibilities already present, just not labeled. I asked my grandmother if she trusted me. Her eyes widened, but she nodded. I uncorked both vials. She gasped and stepped back, but I was already moving, not pouring them on myself or on her or on the ground. Instead, I held them up to the moonlight, watching the impossible colors swirl and merge in the air between the open containers. The liquids didn't pour out. They floated, defying gravity, drawn to each other like magnets. They met in the space between the vials and began to mix, creating reactions that hurt to watch, colors that shouldn't exist, sounds like glass breaking and bells ringing and something vast taking a breath. My grandmother was shouting, asking what I was doing, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of the liquids merging. The combined substance hung in the air, pulsing, growing, taking shape. Not a door, not an ending, something else. A third thing the pattern hadn't labeled because it didn't want people to know it existed. Recognition. The merged liquid showed every moment of the last 40 years simultaneously. My grandmother in the clearing, my grandfather in the real world. The parallel paths they'd walked, separated by the thinnest of veils. Every time he'd thought of her, every time she'd watched him through the twilight, every moment of longing and grief and love that had never died despite the separation, and threaded through it all a connection that had never actually broken. The bargain had separated them physically, but it couldn't sever what they meant to each other. That bond had existed across the veil, invisible but unbreakable for 40 years. The pattern had hidden this truth because it was dangerous. If people knew their connections survived the separation, they might not fear the bargains so much, might find ways to communicate across the veil, might discover that the twilight prisons weren't as absolute as they seemed. The merged liquid began to solidify, taking physical form. It became a thread, golden and thin, stretching from my grandmother's chest toward the forest, toward the real world beyond the twilight. She stared at it in shock, then reached out and touched it. The moment her fingers made contact, her entire body jerked like she'd been electrocuted. Her eyes rolled back and she collapsed. I caught her before she hit the ground, lowering her onto the grass as gently as my torn hands allowed. Her chest was still rising and falling, but she was unconscious, her expression cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Grief, joy, pain, love, all of it happening at once. The golden thread pulsed with light, and I understood what was happening. It was feeding her every moment my grandfather had thought of her over 40 years. Every time he'd looked at her photograph, every time he'd worked on the music box, every time he'd researched ways to break the pattern, every moment of love and regret and desperate hope. 4 decades of emotion compressed into seconds, downloaded directly into her consciousness. It should have killed her. The human mind wasn't meant to process that much feeling at once, but she was breathing, surviving, absorbing it all. The thread grew brighter, and suddenly I could see the other end of it, stretching beyond the clearing, through the half-real forest, across the veil, into the real world. And at that other end, impossibly, was my grandfather. Not alive, not really, but not completely gone either. The thread had connected to something he'd left behind. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but an echo, a resonance, the shape of him that existed in my grandmother's memory, in my fading recollection, in the pattern of his life preserved in photographs and journals and carved dolls. He was looking directly at me, and for just a moment, I remembered. His face snapped into perfect clarity, the crooked nose broken in his youth, the scar on his chin from a childhood fall, the specific way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the sound of his laugh, deep and rough, the smell of his tobacco, the weight of his hand on my shoulder. Everything the trials had taken flooded back in a rush so intense I couldn't breathe. Then he looked past me to my grandmother, unconscious on the grass, and his expression broke. Love and grief and regret and joy all visible in the lines of his face, in the tears streaming down his cheeks. He mouthed words I couldn't hear. I'm sorry. I love you. I was afraid. The golden thread pulsed one final time, blindingly bright, and I felt something fundamental shift in the clearing. The too perfect grass became ordinary. The impossible moon faded. The translucent trees solidified into normal oaks and maples. The twilight dissolved like morning fog, replaced by simple afternoon sunlight filtering through ordinary leaves. We were in a regular forest clearing, in a regular state park, and the magic was gone. Almost all of it. My grandmother gasped and opened her eyes. She sat up, looking around wildly, and I saw that she had changed. Not aged, not exactly, but become more present, more solid, more real than she'd been moments before. As if she'd been a photograph and was now a person, dimensionality restored. She looked at her hands and started crying, touching the grass, the earth, feeling it solid beneath her fingers. After 40 years of twilight half-reality, she could finally feel the world again. But when she looked at me, her expression shifted to horror. I looked down at myself and understood why. The golden thread hadn't disappeared. It had moved. One end was still connected to my grandmother's chest, pulsing with faint light. But the other end was now connected to mine. I had become the bridge, the connection point. The thing that held the door open between her and the echo of my grandfather, between the pattern and the real world, between what was lost and what remained. I hadn't broken free of the bargain. I had become part of its infrastructure. My grandmother reached for me, but her hand passed through my arm like I was smoke. I looked down and saw that parts of me were becoming translucent, flickering between solid and not, between present and absent. I was becoming a threshold, a door, a living passage between realities. The old man's voice echoed from the trees, though I couldn't see him. Interesting solution, crude but effective. The pattern accepts your offering. Then I felt it, the weight of what I'd become settling onto my shoulders like a physical thing. I could sense them now, all the lost souls trapped in twilight spaces throughout the world, all calling to the new door, all asking for passage, all desperate for someone to see them and acknowledge their existence. And I could sense other things too, creatures that lived in the spaces between realities, bargain makers, things that wanted passage to the human world, all of them now aware that a new door had opened, all of them moving toward me. I would spend the rest of my life as a beacon, drawing attention from everything that existed in the margins. Some would be people like my grandmother, trapped by bargains and desperate to return home. Others would be things that should stay in the dark, predators looking for prey. And I would have to choose, over and over, whether to let them through. My grandmother was screaming now, sobbing, reaching for me, but unable to touch me. She was free, but I was the price. She had escaped twilight, but I had become it. I tried to speak, to tell her it was okay, that I'd chosen this. But my voice came out wrong, layered, harmonized, like multiple people speaking at once. The voice of a threshold, not a person. She understood anyway. She could see it in my flickering form, in the way reality bent around me, in the golden thread connecting us that pulsed with my grandfather's echo. I had found the third option the pattern hadn't wanted me to find, not opening the door for her return while I took her place, not sealing the door and leaving her to fade, but becoming the door itself, a permanent passage, a living threshold that would allow her to exist in the real world while still connected to what she'd left behind. It was clever. It was stupid. It was the only choice I could make that felt like mine. The old man stepped out from between the trees, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked tired, his two bright eyes dimmed. He told me I was the third person in 3,000 years to find this particular solution. The other two had lasted 6 months and 14 years, respectively, before the weight of being a door had destroyed them, left them as permanent fixtures in the pattern's architecture. Consciousness dissolved into the infrastructure. He asked if I understood what I'd done to myself. I did. I had traded human existence for something else. I would age differently now, experience time differently, perceive reality differently. I would be visited constantly by things seeking passage. I would never be alone again, never be truly present in just one reality. And there was no reversal. no closing the door I'd become. This was permanent. He nodded slowly and told me that doors eventually came to work for people like him. It was inevitable. The pattern had ways of bringing its pieces into alignment. He would be seeing me again, probably sooner than I'd like. Then he turned and walked back into the forest that was rapidly becoming ordinary trees in an ordinary park. My grandmother stood and walked to me, tears streaming down her face. She could touch me now, barely, just the faintest sensation of contact, like touching smoke. She asked if I regretted it. The answer was complicated. I had saved her, but lost myself. I had broken free of the binary choice, but become enslaved to something worse. I had refused to let fear decide, but maybe should have been more afraid. But looking at her standing in real sunlight for the first time in 40 years, seeing her breathe real air and feel real earth beneath her feet, seeing the might-have-beens around her start to fade as she became anchored in actual reality. It was hard to call it a mistake. She told me she would find a way to reverse this, to free me from what I'd become. She would spend however long it took researching, investigating, searching for a solution. I told her not to bother. This was my choice, my consequence, my price. And maybe, just maybe, I could use it for something good. Maybe I could be the door that opened for people who deserved passage, that closed for things that deserved to stay trapped. Maybe I could be a part of the pattern's machinery that helped instead of just exploited. It wasn't the ending I'd expected, but it was an ending. We walked out of the forest together, my grandmother solid and real, me flickering between states of existence. The parking lot looked exactly as I'd left it, though my phone said 5 days had passed. 5 days missing. 5 days of my life simply gone, while I walked through trials and made choices that had fundamentally altered what I was. My grandmother got in the car, looking at the modern vehicle with wonder and terror. 40 years of technological advancement had passed her by. The last time she'd been in a car, it had manual everything. No computers, no screens. This must have seemed alien. I drove us back to the city as the sun set, neither of us ready to speak about what had happened, what we'd lost, what we'd become. The ordinary world looked thin to me now, like a painted backdrop I could see through if I looked at the right angle. And I could see things I hadn't before. Figures standing at crossroads, shadows moving independently. Windows showing different realities depending on perspective. The world was full of thresholds and in-between places, and now I was one of them. When people passed us on the street, some of them paused and stared. An old woman crossed herself. A young man with occult tattoos nodded respectfully. A child pointed and whispered to their mother about the doorman. They could see what I'd become. My apartment had changed. The space was larger inside than outside now, rooms extending in impossible directions, doors leading places that shouldn't exist. I had become a threshold, and my home had become a house of thresholds, a nexus where realities intersected. The music box sat on my kitchen table where I'd left it. When I opened it, both figures were present, my grandfather and my grandmother, hands touching. But as I watched, my grandfather's figure began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone. The echo was dissolving. The golden thread had given my grandmother everything he'd left behind, every emotion and memory and moment of love. Now there was nothing left of him to preserve, even in carved wood. My grandmother saw it happen and broke down completely, sobbing in a way that sounded like it was tearing her apart from the inside. She had finally gotten to say goodbye, had finally received all the love he'd never been able to express. But now he was truly gone, not just dead, but but completely absent from the world. I held her as well as I could in my flickering state, and we cried together, her for the man she'd loved and lost twice, me for the grandfather I'd sacrificed and could now remember clearly thanks to the thread's brief restoration of my memories. His face was sharp in my mind again, the sound of his laugh, the weight of his hand on my shoulder, every lesson he'd taught, every moment we'd shared. The thread had given me back what the trials had taken, at least temporarily, but I could feel it fading, the memories becoming soft again at the edges. The price was still being paid. I would remember that he'd existed, that he'd been important, that he'd loved me, but the specific shape of him would blur and fade until only outlines remained. We stayed like that for a long time, two people marked by sacrifice and choice, sitting in an impossible apartment in an ordinary city, grieving for a man who had been too afraid to make the choice I'd made, but brave enough to leave me the path to make it. Eventually, my grandmother fell asleep on my couch, exhausted by 40 years of tension finally released, by the flood of emotions from the golden thread, by the simple reality of being free. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the music box with only one figure remaining, my grandmother, frozen in carved wood, forever waiting for a reunion that had finally happened. I closed the box gently and put it on a shelf where it would stay. Then I felt it, the first visitor. Something was approaching my threshold, drawn by the beacon I'd become. I could sense it moving through the spaces between realities, getting closer, preparing to ask for passage. This was my life now, my purpose, my curse. I stood and walked to my apartment door, opening it to reveal not the hallway but something else. A space between spaces. A room that existed in my apartment and outside it simultaneously. A threshold. And standing in that threshold was a young woman, translucent and flickering, clearly trapped in some twilight space like my grandmother had been. She looked terrified and hopeful in equal measure. She asked if I was the door, if I could help her get home. I looked at her for a long moment, using the flower woman's mark to see her might-have-beens, the echo's brand to sense what she'd sacrificed, the river's mark to hear the voices calling her name from the other side. Then I made my choice. I stepped aside and let her through. She solidified as she crossed my threshold, becoming real and present, gasping as she touched the ordinary floor of my apartment hallway. She looked at me with tears of gratitude and ran, disappearing down the stairs toward freedom. I closed the door and felt the weight of what I'd done. I had facilitated passage. I had acted as the door I'd become, and somewhere in the pattern's vast architecture, something had noticed and approved. This was my life now, helping lost souls find their way home, and probably, eventually, making mistakes, letting through things that shouldn't be let through, becoming a tool of the pattern I'd tried to break. But for now, in this moment, I had helped someone. That had to count for something. My grandmother stirred on the couch, murmuring in her sleep, probably dreaming of my grandfather, of the 40 years they'd lost, of the brief, perfect moment of connection before he faded completely. Outside my window, the city continued its ordinary business, unaware that one of its residents had become something else, a threshold between worlds, a living door that would attract the lost and the seeking and the dangerous for as long as I continued to exist. I didn't know how long that would be. The old man had said the other two door people had lasted months or years before breaking. Maybe I would last longer. Maybe I wouldn't. But I had chosen this, had walked the path, survived the trials, paid the prices, and found a third option that felt more mine, than the binary the pattern had offered. The consequences were terrible and permanent. The weight was crushing. The responsibility was infinite. But my grandmother was free, and I had helped someone else find freedom too. Tomorrow would bring more visitors, more choices, more consequences. The old man would come calling eventually, asking for favors, trying to use me for the pattern's purposes. Other things would come too, things less innocent than lost souls seeking passage. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, my grandmother was free, breathing real air in the real world. Tonight, I had made a choice that felt right, even if the cost was everything. Tonight, we were both alive in our own ways, changed by our journey, but not destroyed by it. I sat by the window and watched the city lights come on, my form flickering between solid and translucent, between present and absent, between human and threshold. The door I had become stood open, and through it I could hear them calling, all the lost ones, all the trapped souls, all the people who needed passage. I didn't know yet whether I would answer all of them, or which ones I would refuse, or how long I could maintain the boundary between help and harm. But I had time to learn, and this time every choice would be truly mine, made with open eyes and full knowledge of the consequences. No fear deciding for me, no pattern forcing my hand. The music box sat silent on its shelf, holding only one figure now, a reminder of bargains made and prices paid and love that survived even separation and death. My grandmother slept peacefully for the first time in 40 years, and I stood guard at my threshold, preparing for whatever came next, carrying the weight of my choices, marked by my journey, changed into something neither fully human nor fully other. The door stood open. The night was just beginning, and I was ready. The end, and the beginning, and everything in between.